In the dead of winter, high in the unforgiving Cascade Mountains, a battle-scarred veteran and his colossal black stallion stumbled upon two rangers abandoned to the snow, their bodies already stiffening against the cold. Survival seemed unthinkable until the stallion moved with an instinct no man could have foretold. That moment unraveled not only a fight against the wilderness, but a collision with betrayal, hidden cartels, and a name Thomas Grayson thought he had buried years ago. The wind prowled through the ridges in a long, bone-deep howl, shaking loose needles from the pines and scattering silver dust across the slopes. Snow drifted in quiet veils, muffling every sound, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Above, a pale moon strained through restless clouds, casting broken shards of light onto the white earth. Winter here was no season, it was judgment, silence edged in steel, a trial meant to strip men down to their core. Thomas Grayson pushed forward through the drifts, his boots crunching with each measured step. At 45, his frame was still carved from years of carrying weight no ordinary life demanded. His beard, streaked with gray, caught frost like iron filings, and his steady gray eyes swept the dark timberline with a vigilance that never slept. War had left echoes behind them, echoes he never spoke of, but carried like scars beneath the skin. An olive-green hunting jacket clung to him, seams worn to threads, jeans patched at the knees, gloves cracked and molded to his hands by years of use. Across his shoulder rested a battered lever-action rifle. He did not carry it for sport, and never for pride. It was a habit born of survival, as necessary as breath in his lungs. Tonight, as on every night, Thomas was not out here to hunt. He was out here because discipline demanded it, because routine was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. But the night had other plans, and before dawn broke, the snow would not only reveal two men gasping for life, it would expose a secret buried in blood, one that would drag Thomas into a reckoning no rifle could defend against. Beside him walked a shadow. The horse was massive, jet black, with a coat that caught faint hints of blue under the raddus. Moonlight. His mane was thick and ragged, tossing in the wind, his breath steaming from wide, flared nostrils. He was a creature that looked born from stormlight, untamed, formidable, and yet impossibly loyal to the man at his side. Every step he took sank deep into the fall. No, but his movement was steady, confident. Shadow's eyes caught the silver light, glowing like polished obsidian. He was no ordinary horse. Thomas had learned long ago that this animal had instincts sharper than most men. More than once, Shadow had sensed danger, before Thomas had carried him out of tight corners that might otherwise have ended in silence and blood. To Thomas, Shadow wasn't a mount. He was a partner. Maybe the last partner Thomas trusted. The forest was empty tonight, quiet in a way that set Thomas's nerves humming. He scanned the ridge lines and the tree below, listening. For hours, he had been following the faint tracks of a moo deer, more for the rhythm of the pursuit than for the kill itself. Shadow needed the work, and so did Thomas. The hunt kept both of them home, present, and alive. Then, abruptly, Shadow stopped. The horse stiffened muscles taut under the dark hide. His ears flicked forward, nostrils wide, and a low rumble built in his belly, throat. His hooves pressed deep into the snow as he froze in place. Thomas lifted a hand instinctively. "What is it, boy?" he muttered. Shadow gave a sharp, short whicker, then swung his head toward the west, down a narrow cut between the ridges. Without hesitation, the stallion stepped off the game trail hooves, crunching ice as he veered toward a narrow, shadowed hollow. Thomas's gut tightened. He slung the rifle forward, finger brushing the cold steel of the trigger guard. Instinct told him this wasn't deer. This was something else. The snow grew deeper as they descended, toward the hollow flakes, whipping into their faces as the wind shifted. The shadows thickened beneath the rocks, pooling where the moonlight failed to reach. That was when Thomas saw it. Blood. It smeared the snow in a ragged trail, dark against the blinding white. Not animal blood. The color was too deep. The amount too much. Shadow lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he followed the scent with urgency, hooves pawing the ground. Thomas knelt, brushing away powder. His gloved fingers came away stained. He scanned the ground quickly. Bootprints staggered across the slope, one dragging behind. Whoever it was had been bleeding heavily, stumbling, fighting to move. Shadow snorted and pulled ahead, leading him toward the base of a rock shelf where snow had drifted thick against the stone. Thomas pushed through the crust of ice and froze. There, half buried beneath the drift, lay two bodies. He dropped to his knees instantly. They weren't corpses, not yet. Both were women, their uniforms instantly recognizable, even in the dim, light U.S. Forest Service Rangers. The first sprawled on her side was in her mid-30 seconds. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, blood already staining the snow beneath her. Her face was pale, lips blue with cold, but her eyes flickered weakly open as he leaned over her. The second was younger, barely into her 20 seconds. She lay unmoving, blood soaking her shoulder and upper chest. Her face was ashen, breath shallow and ragged, one arm limp across the snow. The older one forced her lips to move a whisper, barely audible above the wind. "Help! Easy," Thomas said quickly, already stripping off his gloves. His hands moved by instinct, the training never forgotten. He pressed his fingers to the younger woman's neck. Weak pulse, but still there. He leaned to check. The other found her, breathing shallow fast. Both alive? Barely. Beside him, Shadow pawed the ground anxiously, tossing his head and huffing steam. The horse lowered his head, pressing his nose gently against the older woman's jacket, almost urging her to stay awake. Thomas glanced around. Spent shell casings gleamed faintly in the snow. Boot tracks led into the darkness and vanished. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. He dug into his pack, pulling free strips of bandage, a flask of water, and a needle thread kit. His breath smoked in front of him as he worked quickly. "Hold on," he muttered, pressing cloth against the younger ranger's wound, tying it tight to stem the bleeding. She didn't stir, but her breathing steadied by a fraction. The older woman groaned as he straightened her leg, grimacing through clenched teeth. Thomas snapped off 2 branches, stripped them quickly, and bound them to her limb with rope. "That's the best I can do for now," he said. She gave the barest nod, eyes glassy with pain. Shadow shifted closer, lowering his massive body to the snow. He bent his front legs, easing down until his chest nearly touched the ground. His great head swung toward the injured woman as if offering himself. Thomas understood. "Come on," he told her firmly, sliding an arm beneath her shoulders. "Lean on him. He'll take your weight." It took all her strength, but she managed to grasp Shadow's thick mane, pulling herself against his neck. The horse stood slowly, lifting her upright, steadying her as if he'd done it 100 times for the unconscious one. Thomas had to improvise. He stripped off his own canvas coat, lashed it between 2 pine limbs, and created a crude stretcher. He heaved the young woman onto its teeth, gritted against the strain, then tied the stretcher to Shadow's saddle rigging. "Easy," he whispered to the stallion. "Take it slow. She can't take a jolt." Shadow snorted once, stamping the snow, but stood perfectly still as Thomas secured the load. When everything was ready, Thomas looped an arm around the older ranger's waist, guiding her, while Shadow bore the weight of both women. The image was surreal. A battle-scarred Marine, a black warhorse of a stallion, and 2 wounded rangers stumbling through a storm. The wind rose, driving snow into their faces. The moon vanished behind clouds, and darkness pressed in. Thomas bent his head against the gale voice, low but steady. "Hold on. We're not dying out here. Tonight." The journey back was slow and brutal. Each step sank into drifts that reached Thomas's shins, and every gust threatened to topple them. He kept his hand on the older ranger, the other gripping Shadow's reins. The stallion moved with deliberate power, carving a path through the storm, leaving deep imprints like a trail of hope carved into the white. The younger ranger shifted once on the stretcher, a faint groan escaping her lips. Thomas leaned down. "Stay with me," he said. "Almost there." Shadow pressed forward, steady as bedrock, his breath rolling in clouds of steam. Ahead, through the blur of snow, Thomas caught sight of it, a dark shape against the storm. The abandoned ranger station. Relief flickered in his chest. He urged Shadow onward, step by step, through the howling silence of Cascade. Winterman and horse carried their fragile burdens toward the faint promise of shelter. The old ranger station crouched at the edge of the timberline, half buried in snow. Its log walls were weather-worn and streaked with rot. The windows cracked with spiderweb fractures that glittered faintly in the firelight inside. The place smelled of old pine resin smoke and damp wood, the kind of scent that seeped from buildings left to the mercy of storms for too many years. Thomas had managed to coax a fire to life in the stone hearth. Dry branches snapped and hissed as flames licked upward, spilling a fragile circle of warmth into the room. The heat was faint, but steady enough to push back the cold that seeped from the cracked windows and the warped door. He crouched near the hearth, rubbing his hands close to the flames before returning to his patients. Nora Hayes sat propped against the log wall, her uniform jacket shredded and stiff with blood. A rough splint bound her broken leg branches, tied with strips of canvas. From Thomas's coat, her face was pale under strands of damp hair, eyes heavy-lidded but watchful. Across from her, stretched close to the fire, lay Elena Cruz. The younger ranger hadn't stirred since Thomas dragged her from the snow. Her breathing was shallow, her skin chalk white against the dark stain, spreading across her shoulder bandages. Shadow stood at the door, his great body filling the frame like a guardian carved in black stone. His breath streamed in clouds curling white in the cold air, and his ears twitched at every creak of the wind outside. Occasionally, he stamped a hoof, the sound sharp in the silence, as though reminding the room he was still there, still watching. Thomas adjusted Elena's blanket, then pushed to his feet. His eyes landed on the old emergency radio mounted in a dented metal case near the door. The thought came hard and fast call for help, but the moment he crossed the floor and reached for the latch, Nora's voice cut through the crackle of fire. "Don't." Her voice was hoarse, cracked with pain, but edged with urgency. Thomas froze, hand hovering over the radio. He turned. Nora was staring at him, her lips pale, but her eyes burning. "Don't call it," she rasped, forcing a breath into her words. "Don't use the radio. Wallace will trace the signal." Thomas's chest tightened at the name. His hand dropped slowly away from the radio. The flames cast flickering light across his face, catching the hard lines, and the faint scar at his jaw. He studied her in silence for a long moment. "You said Wallace." His tone was flat, but his eyes sharpened like steel. Nora nodded every movement, making her WSE. "We tried," she whispered. "When they hit us, when the first shots came." Elena grabbed the mic. "We called for backup. Within seconds, the frequency was jammed. Interference cut us off like a blade. Someone was listening. Someone was waiting for us to call." She coughed, clutching at her side. "If you try now, you'll bring them straight here." Thomas drew a slow breath. Through his nose, gaze slipping back to the radio. What should have been a lifeline had become a beacon for predators. He understood the implication. Communication wasn't safety. It was a death sentence. He crouched beside her again, his eyes steady on hers. "You're saying they were ready for you before you even made contact." Nora gave a weak laugh that had no humor in it. "They were waiting for us like wolves at a trap." Her words hung heavy in the small cabin. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees as if echoing her warning. Thomas shifted, settling back on his heels. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me everything." Nora closed her eyes, gathering strength, and opened them again. Each sentence came broken, punctuated by pain, but her determination cut through. The weakness. "We were ordered to check a trail near the southern ridge," she began. A faint, mule track intel suggested it was being used as a route, not for hikers, for shipments, drugs. We weren't given much, just recon only. No backup, no tactical support, just a light sweep. Thomas frowned. He'd heard those orders before, in another life, in another desert. Recon only, no support, always. The kind of mission where men didn't come back. "We moved in at dusk," Nora continued. "It was quiet, too quiet." Then, her breath hitched. Gunfire from both sides. No warning, no demands. They were set up waiting. Elena went down in the first volley, shoulder shut. I turned to cover her then. She tapped her splinted leg. Round. Took me down too. She shut her eyes, swallowing hard. They didn't even finish the job. Just kept us pinned until we stopped moving. I heard them laughing. One of them. She opened her eyes again, horror flickering across them. He called my name. My name Thomas. He said it like a joke. Then he laughed and fired over my head. Her voice trembled as she whispered the conclusion. "That means they knew exactly who we were, where we'd be. That information doesn't leak unless someone gave it to them." The fire snapped loud in the silence that followed. Thomas's jaw flexed. He stared at the flames, but his thoughts weren't on the fire. They were on a face he hadn't seen in more than a decade, a name he hadn't spoken in just as long. Gerald Wallace. The name settled like lead in his chest. Nora must have seen it in his eyes, because she nodded faintly. "Yes," she murmured. "It was him, Deputy Chief. Wallace. He signed our orders. He sent us out there with nothing. He set us up." Thomas didn't answer at first. The flames painted his features in harsh strokes, shadowed the scar that cut across his cheekbone, made his eyes look older than his ears. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy with memory. "I know, Wallace." His hand tightened on the rifle across his knees, knuckles pale against the wood. "He was my commanding officer in Afghanistan. He gave orders that sent good men into the ground, covered it up, pinned the fallout on anyone who couldn't fight back. When I stood against him, he buried me too." Nora swallowed, wincing. "He hasn't changed." Thomas's eyes were flint in the firelight. "He never will." The cabin fell, quiet again. Outside, the wind wailed through the rafters, a mournful sound that carried down from the ridges like a warning. Inside, the fire flickered, casting orange against the rough Hunid walls, warming the silence between breaths. Elena stirred faintly, a moan escaping her lips. Thomas moved quickly, kneeling to check the bandages, pressing gently against the wound. Her skin was cold, but the bleeding had slowed. He adjusted the cloth eyes grim. "She needs time and heat," he said quietly. "We keep her alive, or all of this dies with her." Nora exhaled, leaning back against the wall, her face lined with pain and exhaustion. She turned her gaze toward the doorway where Shadow stood tall and motionless, watching the night. His silhouette filled the frame, ears pricked forward, every muscle alert. "If it weren't for him," Nora whispered, "we'd still be lying in that snow." Thomas looked up at her, then at the stallion. The horse didn't move, but the gleam of his eyes in the firelight was enough. Thomas nodded once. "You're right," he said softly. "And this isn't over. Not by a long shot." But now, his voice hardened. "Now I know exactly who we're up against." The fire popped, again, sending sparks spiraling upward. Beyond the cracked glass, the storm raged on, snow drifting sideways in the peel. Wind. In that moment, the cabin felt like a lone island, adrift in a sea of ash. Darkness. The silence held three things: the warmth of fire, the weight of names, unspoken for too long, and the shadow of Wallace looming like a storm on the Wallace horizon. And all of them knew the night was only the beginning. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a bed of embers, glowing faintly red beneath collapsing logs. The cabin was steeped in silence, the kind of silence that was deeper than sleep, stretched thin across the brittle hours between midnight and dawn. Outside, the storm had eased, but the forest still whispered with shifting snow, the sigh of branches heavy with ice, the breath of a wilderness that never truly rested. Shadow stood at the door like a sentinel, carved in obsidian. His body filled the threshold, his head lifted, nostrils steaming in the cold air that seeped through the cracks. His ears flicked sharply, catching sounds only he seemed able to hear. The stallion's chest rose and fell in quickened rhythm. A low rumble vibrated in his throat, followed by a sharp snort of breath that misted the air. Then, almost soundless, he stamped a below. Hoof once, twice into the floorboards. Thomas's eyes snapped open. Years of habit woke him fully before his body had moved. He rolled silently from the chair by the fire rifle, already in his hands, eyes narrowing to slits as he registered Shadow's agitation. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, though he already knew. The horse tossed his head, gave a low, restless whicker, then stared at the door. Thomas rose slow and quiet, motioning with a flat palm for Nora to stay. Silent. She had stirred at the sound, blinking through pain and exhaustion, but the sight of his expression and the tautness in Shadow's posture kept her still. Thomas padded to the door boots soundless on the wooden floor. He eased the latch up with deliberate care and cracked the door just wide enough for his eyes. A knife edge of cold sliced into the room, stinging his face, but he ignored it. The forest stretched before him, silvered by the fading moonlight. Snow hung like mist between the trees, drifting in soft spirals. For a moment, he saw nothing but white shadows and black trunks. Then, movement, two shapes, faint, half concealed among the pines. They weren't hunters. The way they moved, slow and deliberate, wasn't the way of men's stalking game. They were too careful, too still. One lingered in the same spot too long, watching. The other shifted position, crouching near a line of snow-capped rocks, eyes trained on the cabin. Thomas's stomach hardened. Whoever they weren't here to rescue. They were here to confirm what the bullets in the forest had tried to ensure, that Nora and Elena were dead. He shut the door softly and crossed back to the hearth. "They're out there," he said low. Two of them watching. Nora's eyes widened, breath quickening. They came to finish it. Not tonight, Thomas replied, voice clipped. He set his rifle aside for a moment and began pulling gear from his pack. Wire, snares, a hunting knife, coils of steel, small tools meant for trapping game. Tonight, they would serve another purpose. He strode to the windows and began hammering boards across the glass with Shadow's help. The stallion braced his massive body against the wood as Thomas wedged it tight, sealing off the openings. Shadow shifted his weight steady as an anchor, while Thomas drove nails through. Nora pushed herself upright with effort, trembling hands working at the revolver on her belt. She broke it open, slid cartridges into the empty chambers with fingers that shook, then snapped it. Shut. You'll need this more than me, she said, holding it out. Thomas shook his head. Keep it. If they breach this place, you'll need to hold them long. Enough for me to clear the rest. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she obeyed, setting the revolver in her lap with both hands wrapped around it. The cabin filled with a tight, brittle energy, the kind of tension that hummed in the bones. Every creak in the rafters, every sigh of the wind outside felt like a footstep, a breath, the whisper of death waiting just beyond the walls. Thomas finally stepped back from the last window chest, rising with a quiet breath. He looked at Nora. They'll come back, he said, voice iron. Next time it won't be for a look. Next time, they'll come to kill. The night stretched long and cruel. When? Morning finally bled through the cracks. It came pale and gray. A thin wash of conflow, light that turned the snow outside into endless fields of dull silver. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that swallowed the roots of the pines. The air was brittle, sharp as glass. Inside, the fire had been stoked back to life, though the warmth barely touched the edges of the room. Elena still lay unconscious, but her breathing was more, even the rise and fall of her chest, steadier thanks to the constant heat and the bandages Thomas had changed through the night. Nora dozed fitfully, revolver never far from her hand. Thomas stood near the door, rifle across his shoulder, Shadow waiting at his side. The horse's coat glistened faintly where frost clung to it, eyes fixed on the pale horizon. I'll check the perimeter, Thomas said. Nora stirred. Alone, not alone. He touched Shadow's thick mane. He'll lead me. You stay here. Keep the fire alive. If anyone comes through that door that isn't us, I shoot. Her voice was grim, steady despite exhaustion. Thomas nodded once, then slipped out, into the snow. The forest was a cathedral of silence. Snow muffled every step, the only sound the crunch beneath Thomas's boots and the steady rhythm of Shadow's hooves. The horse moved with purpose, head low, nostrils testing the air. They followed the slope down to where a frozen stream cut through the valley. The water was locked under a sheet of ice coated in layers of drifted snow. Shadow halted near a bend, ears prick-ricked, then began pawing the ground. Show me, Thomas muttered. The stallion scraped at the snow with powerful strokes until the ice beneath showed through stray with something dark. Blood old, but not ancient. Thomas crouched, gloved hand brushing the surface. The cold burned through leather as he dug, chipping away frost, until something metallic caught the light. He pulled it free, a pistol half buried in ice. The slide was frozen stiff at the barrel, wrapped in tape. He turned it in his hand, brushing frost from the steel. Then his eyes found the engraving on the passer frame. Thomas's heart lurched. Franks, he whispered. David Franks, a patrol officer from Mill Creek, a man Thomas had once known by reputation, quiet, loyal, the kind who kept his head down but never turned away from trouble. He had vanished 6 months ago. Official word said personal leave, maybe a disappearance of choice, but Thomas had never believed it. Now, the truth was in his hand. Beside him, Shadow pawed again, snorting sharply. Snow flew, and something else emerged. A glove, black tactical fabric, the palm torn open, crusted with dark stains. Thomas lifted it slowly. Blood had dried. Along the threads, faint but unmistakable. He stood in the frozen silence, the gun, heavy in one hand, the glove in the other. The forest felt smaller, tighter, as though the trees themselves were leaning closer to hear. He turned to Shadow, voice low. Not an accident. Murder. The horse blew steam from his nostrils, stamping hard enough to crack the surface of the ice. Thomas's mind began to stitch the fragments together. Franks had been digging into the smuggling routes. He had vanished without a trace. Now his sidearm and his glove lay hidden in a stream not a mile from where Nora and Elena had been ambushed. The ambush hadn't been a coincidence. It wasn't. just corruption. It was a campaign, one that silenced anyone who dared to pull the veil away. He clenched the Glock in his hand, of the cold steel burning against his palm. His eyes hardened gray iron in the pale morning light. "Wallace," he said, the name like a curse in the snow. Shadow answered with a deep, throaty snort, pawing the earth as if in agreement, as if the stallion, too, understood the weight of what they had uncovered. Thomas stared down the length of the frozen stream, the horizon blurred by drifting flurries. The picture was clear now. Wallace hadn't just betrayed. He was burying every piece of evidence, every honest man or woman who stood in his way. And now, Thomas knew there would be no more doubt, no more hesitation. The storm had declared its master, and Thomas Grayson was ready to fight back. The Glock and the torn gloves still weighed in Thomas's pack when he returned to the ranger station. His boots stamped frost from the threshold as Shadow pushed in behind him, the stallion's breath fogging the room. Nora looked up from where she leaned against the wall, her leg propped on folded blankets, face pale beneath the rabble. A flicker of firelight. Thomas set the pack down, found them by the frozen creek, he said. His voice was low even, but the weight in it made her grip her revolver tighter. "What did you find?" He pulled the gun free first, even dulled by frost. The badge number on the frame gleamed clear. He laid it across the table. "Zo 4191 francs." The name landed like a stone in the room. Nora's breath hitched her eyes, closing for a beat. When she opened them, they were sharp with fear and recognition. "Francs," she whispered. He warned me once about the mine road, said we were missing something big." Her voice trembled. 6 months ago, he just vanished. They told us he walked out, left the job, but I knew. She broke off, shaking her head. I knew it wasn't true. Thomas placed the glove beside the pistol. The torn palm, the dried blood, the silent testimony of struggle. "It wasn't desertion," he said. "He died digging too close." For a moment, the fire crackled in silence. Then Thomas straightened, his expression carved from stone. "If we want answers, we go where he went, the mine." Nora hesitated, pain clouding her features, but there was resolve in her not. She leaned toward the cabinet, tugging open a drawer with trembling fingers. From inside, she pulled a rolled map, smudged and worn. She spread it on the table, jabbing a finger at a mark scrolled near the southern ridge. "Here. 2 hours, if the weather holds. The old site." Thomas studied the point, memorizing the terrain around it. He looked at Shadow. The stallion stamped once on the floorboards, snorted steam, and swung his head toward the door as if to say, "What are we waiting for?" They left in the gray wash of dawn, the storm easing, but the air still bitter. Snow sifted down in soft curtains as they moved through the trees. Thomas walked ahead, one arm as steady, around Nora's waist, guiding her careful step by step. Her leg was splinted, but every shift made her WSE. She bore it in silence. Behind them, Shadow moved with deliberate grace, hauling the stretcher rigged to his saddle. Elena lay upon it, bundled in blankets, breath steady but shallow. Each exhale frosted the air above her lips. The forest pressed close and silent. No birds sung, no cracking branches, no life but their own passage. The sound of boots and hooves compacting snow echoed strangely loud, the only rhythm in a world hushed white. Nora glanced once over her shoulder, eyes lingering on the towering stallion pulling her partner. In any other life, she would have called it absurd. 2 rangers carried through the wilderness by a black warhorse, and a man who looked like he'd walked out of a war movie. But now, it was all that stood between them and the graves their enemies had already dug. She pulled her coat tighter and whispered to herself, "This is hope. Strange, impossible hope." The valley opened without warning. The trees thinned, giving way to a barren swath of ground where stumps jutted like broken teeth through snow. Beyond, a slope of scarred earth climbed into the hillside, streaked with veins of ice and shadow. The mine. Thomas halted, eyes narrowing as he scanned the landscape. Rusted rails curled from the snow like the bones of a snake. A collapsed cart, track snaked toward a sagging shack at the base of the slope, its tin siding warped and eaten by rust. Wooden supports lay shattered like matchsticks. It looked abandoned, but the snow told a different story. Tracks cut through drifts, faint tire, ruts fresh enough that wind hadn't filled them. Patches of churned snow near the shack suggested movement, men unloading or staging something. Shadow's head dipped low, ears flat. He released a guttural rumble that rolled deep from his chest. Thomas whispered, "I know. They've been here." The door of the shack groaned when Thomas shoved it open, hinges screaming after years of neglect. The smell hit first, a pungent cocktail of damp wood oil and something acid, beneath like burned plastic. Inside, shadows clung to the corners. He swept his flashlight across the room. Cardboard boxes lay stacked against the walls. Most of them slid open with knife cuts, sharp and recent. They were empty, but the clean slices told a story. Whatever had been inside was removed in a hurry. A camera hung, crooked in one corner lens, cracked cable severed with a quick hand. Not torn, not age-cut deliberately. It had been live not long ago. Thomas moved deeper. The chair stood against the wall, a cheap folding frame of metal. Its legs were wrapped in duct tape residue, still tacky under his fingertips. Rope fibers littered the floor around. Sweat, fear, confinement, the smell lingered. Someone had been held here. Shadow snorted, pawing the ground, his nose thrust toward a corner where a torn tarp hung loosely. Thomas crossed, gripped the edge, and pulled. Beneath lay a black duffel bag. He unzipped it. Packages spilled out tightly, wrapped in plastic, stamped with crude ink. A coiled snake, the number 16. Nora's voice came horsaro behind him. That logo, Delaware, flagged it years ago, every time. Wallace shut the reports down, said the evidence was weak. She gave a bitter laugh. Weak. He buried it all. The air was thick with chemical residue, sharp enough to sting the eyes. This wasn't just storage. It was a processing site. Drugs had been sorted. Here, weighed here, prepared to move deeper into the country. Thomas zipped the bag shut, jaw tight. In one of the side pouches, his fingers brushed paper, a folded scrap damp at the edges, but intact. He opened it carefully, smoothing the creases. Ink had bled in places, but the words were legible. Wallace, Deck 16, Site C3. Norsha leaned closer, eyes wide. "The 16th of December, she whispered. Her hand trembled against the map she carried. "That's less than 2 weeks away." Thomas read the note again, the lines of his face hardening. Wallace wasn't covering shipments, he was directing them. The paper wasn't rumor, it was confirmation. The man who had once commanded him in Afghanistan, the same man who had left men to die for his ambition, was now orchestrating a network in his own backyard. Thomas folded the note and slid it into his coat. "We have a date and a place. That's all we need." Shadow moved. Suddenly, hooves clanging against the concrete floor. His ears pricked, nostrils flared as he pressed toward a patch of damp earth near the back wall. He pawed once, twice, and then scraped deeper until the dirt revealed faint impressions. Paw prints. Thomas knelt, tracing the outline. Dog tracks, not coyote, not wolf. Canine, but wrong. Smaller than standard, the gait uneven, one print, dragging slightly behind the others. Injured. A trained dog, but limping. Thomas brushed snow from the mark and murmured, "Not yours, boy. Another one." Nora's face tightened. "There aren't any K9 units assigned to this region. Not official," Thomas said. "But somebody brought one here, and they've been using it." The idea curdled the air. A working dog, once trained for service, now twisted into a tool for traffickers. Shadow whinnied low, pawing the dirt. Harder, as though offended, as though challenging the ghost of the other animal. Thomas placed a calming hand on his neck. "We'll find out," he said quietly. "If they've taken one of ours, we'll put it right." The group stood in the center of the shack, surrounded by open boxes, plastic-wrapped drugs of the chair that wrire of captivity, and the note that tied it all to Wallace. Every piece clicked into place. This wasn't corruption at the edges. It wasn't a single ambush or one dirty order. It was a lattice, a web, an operation rooted deep. Wallace wasn't a bystander. He was at the center, orchestrating, silencing, eliminating. Thomas's grip tightened on the pistol slung across his chest. His voice was low, but each word cut sharp. "We're standing in the nest. Wallace built this, and he's still out there." Shadow reared slightly, hooves striking the ground with a crack that echoed through the rafters. His neigh thundered. Across the empty hills, rolling back through the forest like a war cry. Thomas didn't stop him. He let the sound carry a declaration into the frozen morning. The hunt had begun. The cabin loomed dark against the snowy ridge when they returned from the mine. Thomas led the way inside Shadow, pressing close behind nostrils, steaming as he carried the weight of their discoveries, both physical and moral. The duffel of drugs, the blood-stained glove, the scrap of paper with Wallace's name, and a date that promised worse to come. Nora lowered herself with a grimace onto the cot near the fire, her splined legs stretched out before her. Elena lay bundled in blankets by the hearths, pale, but warm from the steady glow of flame. Thomas stoked the logs, building the fire into a steady crackle, then sat with his rifle across his knees. Shadow remained outside on the porch, his great body filling the doorway like a sentry. His breath puffed white into the air, ears flicking to every sound that whispered through the trees. No one spoke much. The weight of the mine lingered, a stink of chemicals and rot, clinging even in memory. Each of them knew Wallace would not let the evidence stand. The ambush was only the beginning. The real strike would come soon. Above the cabin and the sky darkened. Clouds pressed, heavy wind rising through the pines, scattering flurries of snow across the clearing. The forest braced itself for another storm, and so did the people huddled inside. It was sometime after midnight when the fire collapsed into glowing coals, painting the room in faint red light. Thomas's head had dipped once, twice, but his eyes snapped open when the sound came. Glass shattered. The crash echoed through the cabin, followed instantly by the dull thud of something striking wood. Splinters sprayed across the floorboards. Down Thomas barked instinct, faster than thought. He shoved Nora flat, his own body covering hers. Another crack, another burst of wood bullets tearing through the walls. Nora's scream was cut short as Shadow thundered into action. The stallion reared at the door, striking with hooves that smashed the already weakened frame. The wooden panels exploded outward, creating a jagged gap to the night. He stood in the breach, head-high muscles rippling under black hide, an unmovable wall between the women and the storm of lead. His roar shook the rafters, and nay that cracked like thunder. From outside came the muzzle flare of rifle staccato, bursts lighting the treane. Shadows of men moved between pines, their shouts carried through radios clipped to their shoulders. Target confirmed. Sweep it clean. Thomas rolled to the window rifle, snapping to his shoulder. He fired twice into the dark. The figures scattered, ducking back behind cover, the chatter of their rifles cutting off abruptly. The silence was worse proof they were repositioning, tightening the noose. The cabin shuddered under each impact. Wood wasn't meant to withstand this storm. Amid the chaos, Shadow struck again. His hooves slammed into the floor and then into the wall near the hearth. The sound was different this time. A hollow thud beneath the boards. His ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, and then he lunged forward, smashing his chest against the wood. The panel gave way, splintering open. Dust and soot spilled from a cavity hidden for decades. Thomas twisted toward the sound, disbelief flashing across his face. The trapdoor, old and forgotten, revealed beneath Shadow's fury. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas muttered, scrambling to his feet. He dropped to his knees, pried at the broken wood until the hatch came free. Beneath gaped a hole, darkness yawning, the smell of cold earth rising from below. A fire escape tunnel back when. These cabins had been lifelines for rangers during wildfires. Shadow stepped back, breath steaming, eyes fixed on Thomas as if to say, "Here, this is the way." Thomas met his gaze and nodded once. "Good work, partner." There was no time to doubt. The walls shook with another volley. Splinters rained across the room. It was this or die. He moved fast, adrenaline sharpening every action. "Nora, you first," he ordered, dragging her upright. She groaned as weight shifted on her leg, but he lowered her carefully through the hatch. She dropped into the dark landing with a grunt. Thomas turned to Elena. She was still unconscious, her face waxing, but her chest rising faintly. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as gunfire rattled the walls. He lowered her into the tunnel. Nora, catching her awkwardly with a muffled curse of pain. Shadow stayed at the breach, massive, body absorbing splinters as bullets punched through the wood. One round grazed his flank, cutting a red streak along his hide. The stallion screamed, reared, but did not retreat. He planted himself wider man flying, holding his ground as the barricade they never had. Thomas grabbed his rifle and fired a burst into the treine, forcing silence again. He shouted down, "Take!" and her, "Hold tight." Then he slung his rifle across his back, dropped through the hatch, and yanked on the trapdoor rope. Shadow followed, astonishing in his size. He crouched, coiled his frame, and forced himself through the opening. Wood screamed in protest, dirt showered from the edges, but the horse shoved and twisted until he slipped through, landing with a bone-rattling thud that shook the narrow tunnel. Thomas grabbed broken boards, scattered them across the hatch, disguising it as best he could in the dim glow of his flashlight. Above, footsteps thundered into the cabin. Voices shouted, "There!" The air filled with heavy boots, the scrape of metal. But when they tore through the rooms, they would find nothing but fire, light, and blood stains. The tunnel pressed around them like the throat of the earth. Dirt walls damp with decades of moisture. The smell of ash and mold clinging to the air. The ceiling was low, forcing Thomas to crouch. He carried the flashlight in one hand, guiding Nora as she hobbled forward, her breath rasping with effort. He bore most of Elena's weight. In the other, her limp body jostling with each step. Shadow came last, shoulders scraping the walls every step, careful but urgent. The stallion's presence filled the tunnel, his breath echoing, loud steam fogging in the beam of light above. Faint thuds shook the boards. Voices filtered down through the earth. "They can't be gone. Search every inch." Thomas pushed harder, urgency driving him forward. "Move," he urged Nora. "They'll find the hatch soon enough. We need distance." The tunnel, twisted, narrow, and uneven, then sloped upward. Sweat trickled under Thomas's collar despite the cold. His muscles burned from carrying Elena, but he didn't slow. Shadow's hooves clanged against buried stones, his pace steady despite the press of walls. Finally, a faint draft kissed Thomas's face. Icy air freedom ahead. The tunnel spat them out into the snow 50 yards behind the cabin. They stumbled into the open, gasping in the sudden cold. Thomas fell to one knee, lowering Elena gently into the drift. Nora collapsed beside her hand, pressed to her chest. Shadows surged out last, exploding from the ground in a spray of dirt and snow, shaking his mane free with a violent toss. Behind them, the cabin burned. Flames licked up through broken windows. The roof glowing with sparks. Smoke churned into the sky, carried on. The storm winds. The attackers had set it alight, erasing evidence, erasing history, believing their prey inside would perish in the blaze. Thomas turned to watch gray eyes catching the firelight. His face was calm, but his jaw set like iron. "We just crawled out of our grave," he said. "But this isn't over. It's only starting." Shadow threw his head back and screamed a neigh so loud it rolled across the valley. It echoed against the mountains, carrying defiance through the snowbound forest. Nora shivered not from cold. She turned, her face away from the inferno and toward the man and horse beside her. They weren't prey, not anymore. Thomas adjusted his grip on the rifle, scanning the tree line. "We move," he said. "There's another ranger post east, abandoned, but it'll give us cover." He slung Elena back into his arms, nodded at Nora, and set off into the snow. Shadow walked ahead, carving a path through the drifts, his body still steaming where the grays burned along. His flank. The fire raged behind them, consuming the cabin to ash. Ahead, the forest waited silent and endless, and somewhere in its depths, Wallace's men were regrouping. But Thomas and Shadow were no longer running. They were hunting. The ranger station crouched in a clearing like a skeleton of another era. Its roof sagged, under years of storms, shingles peeled back by wind, and the outer logs were stained dark with moss and streaks of rot. Snow clung to its eaves, dripping in, frozen icicles that glittered faintly in the moonlight. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The smell of pine, long since replaced by mildew. A cracked map of the Cascade back country still hung on the wall. Its edges curled, its roots faded to illegible lines. A few broken chairs and tables were pushed into corners, ghosts of the patrols who once called this place home. Thomas had coaxed a fire into the hearth. The flames licked at the damp wood, filling the room with more smoke than heat, but it was enough to drive the chill from their bones. He laid Elena down close to the blaze, checking her breathing again, steady, shallow, but holding. Nora eased herself into a sagging chair, her broken legs stretched, before her jaw clenched against pain. Shadow stood by the door, his immense body filling the gap, ears twitching at every whisper of wind. The stallion's breath curled white into the air, steam rising from flared nostrils. He had been restless since they fled the cabin hooves, scraping lightly against the floor as though waiting for the next attack. The silence was suffocating. Every one of them knew the night wasn't finished with them yet. The door burst open. "Don't move." A voice barked sharp and commanding. FBI Thomas spun rifle half raised, but stopped short when he saw her. A tall woman filled the doorway, the glow of the fire cutting across her tactical jacket. Her auburn hair was tied back in a tight knot, her hazel eyes locked on the room with the focus of someone trained to read danger. In a heartbeat, A Glock sat steady in her hands, aimed at Thomas's chest. He didn't lower his weapon, but he didn't raise it either. His voice was low, calm. "We're not your enemy." The woman swept her gaze over the room. Her eyes passed over Nora, pale and trembling, but alert. They lingered on Elena, unconscious by the fire. Then they froze. Shadow had stepped forward, his head high, man ragged but gleaming in the firelight. The woman's breath caught. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." The pistol wavered in her grip, then lowered. Her steps carried her slowly. Forward, almost hesitant. She stopped a few feet from the stallion, eyes wide, face softening with shock. Shadow. Her voice cracked on the name. The horse blew a hot gust of air, ears flicking. He studied her with unblinking eyes, then dipped his head slightly, nostrils flaring as if in recognition. The woman laughed once, a choked sound, then reached out a trembling hand but stopped short. "I thought you were gone. We all did. 5 years ago during the fire. They said no horses made it out. I searched. I tried." She shook her head, tears pricking her eyes. "You vanished." Thomas looked between them, confusion tightening his brow. "You know him?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Rachel Monroe, FBI. Before this, I worked with the Cascade Conservation Project. Shadow wasn't just any Mustang. He was exceptional, too intelligent, too aware. We always said he belonged half to the wild and half to us. And then when the fire came, her voice faltered. We assumed the worst. I've carried his file in my drawer ever since." Shadow shifted, lowering his massive head until his muzzle brushed against her hand. Rachel let out a breath, finally touching him, fingers sinking into the thick black mane. "You're alive," she murmured, "and saving lives again." Later, when weapons had been lowered and introductions made, Thomas and Rachel sat across from each other by the fire. Nora dozed fitfully in her chair, Elena, unconscious nearby. Shadow stood just behind Thomas as though listening to every word. Rachel leaned forward, elbows braced on her knees. "Wallace," she said. "That name, it's not new to me. Every time I traced a shipment, every time I pushed too close, Wallace's name was in the background. Not in reports, not officially, but in whispers. And always the cases got pulled, reassigned, buried." Thomas stared into the fire, his profile cut in harsh orange light. "He was my CO, in Afghanistan," he said, voice flat. "Gerald Wallace. He gave orders that got good men killed. Bad calls, intentional calls. When I tried to report it, my file disappeared. My discharge was written before the ink on my complaint dried." His jaw tightened. "I watched 3 brothers die for his ambition, and he walked away with a promotion." Rachel's hands balled into fists. "Same story here, different battlefield. I lost witnesses, I lost agents. Every time I tried to push through, the ground fell away under me. I thought I was cursed, that I was chasing ghosts. But it wasn't chance, it was him." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire snapping and Shadow's steady breath behind them. Finally, Thomas spoke. "He didn't just ruin us, he built something from it, something that feeds off silence." Rachel's gaze flicked to Nora and Elena. "And now you've got survivors. Witnesses. That's more than I ever had." Thomas nodded, one's eyes hard. "Wallace won't bury this. Not this time." Rachel reached into her jacket and pulled out a slim folder. The paper inside was crease-stained, from days of travel. She spread it across the table: maps, scribbled notes, printouts of cargo manifests, red lines traced highways, rail lines, and forgotten trails. "This isn't local," she said firmly. "The shipments don't stop here. They don't even stop in this state. Wallace is tied into something larger, a pipeline that stretches across state lines. Some of it runs deep enough that the only explanation is federal cover." Nora stirred eyes, opening voice raspy. "That's why every report we filed died in someone's drawer. Why every tip we sent up the chain came back ignored." Rachel met her gaze. "Exactly. He has protection. Maybe not many, but high enough to make him untouchable. Until now." The weight of her words settled like stones. Even Thomas, who had seen the rod of corruption before, felt the chill in them. This wasn't a handful of mercenaries. This wasn't even a cartel with a local partner. This was a lattice of power, a system built to protect Wallace and people like and him. Shadow pawed at the floor once, a sharp scrape that made everyone look his way. He tossed his head, nostrils flaring. "Even he knows," Nora muttered faintly, managing a thin smile despite her pain. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows up the walls. Thomas, Rachel, and Nora sat in a triangle of light, their faces hard with exhaustion and resolve. Elena slept on, still wrapped in blankets, and shadows stood just beyond the circle of firelight, his eyes gleaming like coals in the dark. The silence stretched until Rachel broke it. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a vow. If we combine what we have, your experience, their testimony, and Shadow's protection, we can bring him down. Thomas met her eyes. The years of betrayal, exile, and loss were carved into his face. But in the casa, the firelight, there was something else too. Determination. He nodded once. Then we start now. The alliance was born in that ruined station beneath the watchful eyes of a stallion who had already outlived his own legend. The storm had quieted to a steady fall of snow by the time they decided to go back. None of them wanted to. Even Rachel, who had argued for it, felt the knot in her stomach tighten as they left the safety of the ranger post and moved toward the cabin's remains. The decision had been unanimous. If there was any chance that evidence had survived the fire, they couldn't let it vanish beneath snow and ash. The trail back was slow. Nora leaned heavily on the makeshift crutch Thomas had cut from a pine branch. Elena was bundled across. Shadow's broad back, her fragile weight balanced carefully beneath blankets. Rachel walked rear guard, her Glock loose but ready in her hand, eyes raking the tree for movement. Thomas led the way, rifle slung every step, precise shoulders squared against more than just the cold. The forest swallowed sound. The only noise was the crunch of boots and hooves in snow, the rasp of breath in freezing air. When they reached the clearing, the sight hit them all like a blow. The cabin was no longer a home, not even a ruin. It was a skeleton. The walls stood in jagged pieces, blackened timbers leaning against one another like broken ribs. The roof had collapsed, its beams sagging into a heap of ash and ice. The fire had eaten everything, and then the storm had laid its shroud of white. Nora let out a thin breath. God. Rachel scanned the perimeter, her jaw tight. If Wallace staged this, then he wanted to erase something, which means we need to find it. Thomas moved forward. First, Shadow circled wide ears, flicking nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The stallion's massive form passed between the skeletal beams, his hooves sinking into ash-veiled snow. He made no sound, but his presence filled the clearing like a living sentinel. They combed the wreckage in silence. Thomas overturned scorched boards with his boot. Rachel sifted carefully through the debris flashlight beam, cutting across blackened walls. For a long while, there was nothing, just ruined soot and the whisper of snow falling through broken rafters. Then Rachel froze. Her eyes narrowed on something small, hanging crooked from the beam above, where the kitchen once stood, a smoke detector. But something about it was wrong. The plastic casing was melted at the edges, but intact, the metal bracket half torn from the ceiling. Rachel reached up, tugged it free, and turned it over in her hand. "This doesn't belong," she murmured. Thomas stepped closer. "Why?" She pried at the back with her knife, the casing snapping open, not a smoke detector. Inside, nestled in wires, sat a pinhole lens. Camera Rachel set her voice sharp with realization. Hidden, powered, and it survived. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Show me." Rachel pulled a small reader from her pack, slotted in the micro SD card. The screen flickered, then filled with static. She fast-forwarded, skipping through hours of nothing. An empty cabin, lit only by firelight. Then the image shifted. The camera caught the door, opening. A man entered, tall, shoulders heavy beneath a dark overcoat. He moved with confidence, a gait that Thomas knew as intimately as his own shadow. Gerald Wallace. Even in grainy black and white, his features were unmistakable. The arrogance in his posture, the sharpness of his motions. He crouched near the hearth, lifted a floorboard with practiced ease, and tucked something beneath. A burner phone, a folded map. Then he smoothed the board back into place and walked out without looking back. Rachel's hand tightened on the device. There at Island, not rumor, not hearsay. We have him on tape. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the wind slipping through the broken cabin. They went to work quickly. Thomas and Rachel pried at the boards near the hearth, the ones Wallace had touched. The wood was charred, brittle, but the fire hadn't reached deep. Beneath layers of soot and ash, Thomas's hand closed on plastic. He pulled free a waterproof pouch, the edges blackened, but intact. Inside lay two things: a cheap burner phone, and a folded map marked with thick, red lines. Rachel turned the phone in her hand, scrolling through its limited menu. Recent calls, all numbers blocked, hidden behind layers of anonymity. She frowned, pocketed it. They'll need forensics, but it's something. The map. She unfolded carefully, her breath clouding the cold air. The ink was smeared in places, but the markings were clear. Routes traced through the forest, converging on one point circled in red. Site C3. Nora leaned on her crutch, peering down at the paper. The same site as the note, the mine bag. Thomas nodded grimly. It matches. He wasn't just managing from the shadows. He's been walking these trails, planning. Shipments himself. Wallace is the center, Rachel said flatly. This ties every scrap of evidence together. Thomas wasn't finished. He reached into his pack and pulled out something heavier. A folder edges curled papers, yellowed and frayed. He laid it on the scorch table and slid it toward Rachel. "What's this?" she asked. 10 years? Thomas said. His voice was low, but the firelight caught the weariness in his eyes. 10 years I've carried it, hoping one day someone would look. Rachel opened the folder. Page after a page of typed reports, maps, photographs, detailed accounts of smuggling routes. Running through the Cascades, dates, coordinates, descriptions of vehicles, even photographs. Grainy but damning of men unloading crates beneath cover of night. Every report was signed at the bottom. T. Grayson. Rachel looked up slowly. I filed them, Thomas said. All of it. Wallace dismissed every single one, said the intel was unreliable, the evidence inconclusive. A month later, I was discharged for conduct unbecoming. My file vanished. My career was gone. His voice hardened, and the pipeline kept running. Rachel read in silence, flipping pages, her eyes moving faster, her jaw tightening with each line. When she finished, she set the file down, her hands trembling slightly. It all matches, she whispered. Every piece we found, this is the backbone. He buried the truth because it threatened him. Nora's hand clenched around Elena's shoulder, her eyes wet with fury. How many lives were lost just so he could keep his record clean? Thomas looked toward Shadow, who stood framed against the doorway, black hide dusted with snow. I thought I'd left this behind, he said quietly. Turns out it was just waiting for me. They gathered around the fire again, their spoils spread across the table like offerings of war. The USB Nora had hidden in her jacket, the Glock recovered from the frozen creek, the torn glove, the scrap of paper from the mine, the hidden camera, footage, the burner phone, and map. And Thomas's old reports, a decade of silence finally spoken aloud. Rachel's eyes swept over it all. This is enough to bury him in court. But court isn't what matters right now. She tapped the map. What matters is catching him in the act. Wallace doesn't leave paper trails. He leaves shadows. But he'll be at Site C3, the 16th of December. That's when we ended. Nora's face was pale but steady. That's less than 2 weeks. Then we prepare, Rachel said. He'll expect a clean handoff. We'll give him something else. Thomas leaned forward, his voice like steel. Wallace ruined lives for years. He killed men I served with. He destroyed good rangers. And now, he's coming back here to my mountains. His jaw set. This time, I'll be waiting. Shadows stamped the ground, once a deep thud that echoed through the ruin. His head rose mane, tossing eyes bright in the firelight. He agrees, Nora murmured. The snow outside thickened, driven by gusts of wind that moaned through the broken timbers. Inside, the fire flickered across weary faces set with grim resolve. The weight of proof surrounded them, but proof alone wouldn't stop a man like Wallace. The 16th of December would Thomas rested his rifle beside him, eyes drawn to the silhouette of Shadow, standing watch in the storm. His voice was quiet, but carried through the word. Cabin. This time he said, we don't let him walk away. The horse lifted his head and made the sound, cutting through the storm like a promise. The hunt was no longer for survival. It was for justice. Dawn had not yet broken, but the old mine looked like the skeleton of a giant sprawled across the frozen valley. Rusted girders jutted skyward, warped by decades of storms. Snow clung in thick sheets to the collapsed conveyor lines, transforming the twisted steel into white-coated bones. Fog lay heavy across the ground, coiling around broken carts and shattered timbers, swallowing sound before it could travel. The wind cut sharp through the hollow pipes of the abandoned structures, turning them into mournful flutes that keened in the pre-dawn dark. Thomas crouched high above the yard on a ledge of rock, Shadow at his side. He pressed a hand to the stallion's thick mane, grounding himself. The horse's body was tense beneath his palm, every muscle quivering with anticipation. Below the clearing stretched wide flat as a stage awaiting its players. Behind him, Rachel adjusted the headset at her ear, her breath pluming in the cold. FBI units are set, she whispered. They're circling the perimeter. We wait until Wallace shows himself. Thomas nodded, eyes fixed on the fog. Nora huddled beneath a blanket further back, rifle balanced across her knees despite the splint on her leg. Elena crouched beside her reloading magazines with hands that trembled but did not falter. Thomas leaned close to Shadow, murmuring, "It's time, old friend. Today it ends." The stallion snorted hot vapor, curling from his nostrils like smoke from a dragon's mouth. Engines. The sound came low at first, a growl swallowed by fog. Then it grew, reverberating through the valley, bouncing between the steel frames. 3 vehicles emerged from the mist, a black SUV at the front, followed by 2 battered pickups. Their headlights cut pale beams through the gloom, sweeping across snow and stone before going dark. And as the engines idled, doors opened. Men spilled out boots, crunching on gravel. Gerald Wallace stepped into view. Even from the ledge, Thomas recognized him. Instantly. Broad-shouldered, his black coat snapping in the wind, hair silvering at the temples, but his presence sharp, commanding. His eyes cut across the yard like blades, searching for weakness. 3 armed men flanked him. One carried a metal case held tight with gloved hands. Wallace's voice carried through the still air, harsh and impatient. "Where are they? Where's my buyer?" "We don't have all day," silence answered him. Fog swirled, hiding the FBI's ring. Wallace's jaw tightened, his hand flexing at his side. Rachel whispered into her mic, "Steady. Let him settle." It was Shadow who sensed it first. The stallion stiffened, ears pricking forward, nostrils flaring. He shifted, his weight muscles coiling as if ready to spring, his dark eyes fixed on the ridge to the north. Thomas followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then, just for an instant, a glint sharp and fleeting as the blade of a knife. Sunlight weak, though it was catching on glass. A scope. Sniper Thomas hissed, his pulse hammered. Before he could raise a hand and signal, Shadow moved. The stallion erupted forward, launching from the ledge like a shadow unchained. His hooves struck stone with a thunderclap body, arrowing through the mist. His scream tore the valley in half, a sound so raw it rattled the very air below. The sniper flinched, his finger jerked on the trigger, sending a round wild into the rocks, far from its mark. He swung his scope too late. Shadow hit like a boulder, his chest slamming the shooter from his perch. The man tumbled, rifle clattering down the slope. They rolled together through snow and shale until the man lay gasping, weaponless, scrambling back in panic from the towering black form before him. From the ledge, Thomas exhaled in relief. "You saved us, you magnificent beast," Rachel whispered. Ed, he hadn't. No one finished the thought. Gunfire. Cracked. The failed sniper shot was the spark. From the terrain and broken structures, FBI agents surged forward. Voices booming, "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Wallace's men answered with gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing in the fog. The mine exploded into chaos. Rounds whined through the air, slamming, sparks from steel beams, tearing splinters from rotted timbers. The air filled with the acrid tang of gunpowder. The thick fog now shredded by violence. Thomas braced his rifle on the ledge and fired. His first shot tore through the arm of a gunman crouched behind a crate. The man screamed, weapons spinning away. Rachel sprinted low across the yard, ducking behind rusted carts, her Glock barking precise, controlled shots. One assailant dropped to his knees, another spun and fell clutching his side. Behind cover, Nora sat propped against stone, her broken leg outstretched. Her jaw was clenched with pain, but her hands steady as she fired shot after shot, covering Rachel's advance. Elena knelt beside her, feeding fresh magazines into her hands, her movements frantic but effective. And then Shadow returned. He galloped into the clearing like a storm mane, flying hooves, throwing up snow and gravel. The sight of the colossal stallion barreling straight toward them broke the rhythm of Wallace's men. Several, panicked, firing wild, their shots wasted against the fog. The tide began to turn. Wallace's composure cracked, his face-twisted voice booming over the den. "Don't leave. Survivors. Kill them all." Thomas's mic captured every word, the recorder clipped to his vest, blinking red. Proof undeniable and damning. Keep shouting. Wallace, Thomas muttered under his breath as he fired again his bullet, sending another guard sprawling. Every word digs your grave deeper. One of Wallace's soldiers swung his rifle toward the ridge where Nora and Elena sheltered. His muzzle tracked steadily, locking onto them. Thomas saw it, heart slamming. He fired his round, tearing through the man's shoulder before the trigger could be pulled. The gunman dropped, screaming. Rachel appeared from the side, finishing him with a clean strike to the wrist that sent the weapon clattering. She spun, dropped another target with a burst of fire, then ducked behind a crumbling wall. The battle raged, the fog now lit with fire and fury. In the maelstrom, Wallace gestured sharply to a pickup idling near the edge of the yard. Its bed was covered by a tarp crate strapped. Beneath, a soldier clambered toward it, reaching for a detonator clipped to his vest. But Shadow had already seen. The stallion wheeled ears, pinned flat eyes blazing. His screams split the sky. He charged his hooves pounding like drums of war. The guard barely had time to look up. Shadow slammed his shoulder into the truck with the force of an avalanche. Metal shrieked as the vehicle flipped, crashing onto its side. Crates burst, free, scattering across the gravel. White packets tore open, powder and plastic exploding into the air. The explosion of violence scattered Wallace's men. Panic surged. One dropped, his rifle, and ran. Another screamed, firing blindly before retreating. The neat formation disintegrated. From their flanks, FBI agents surged, seizing the moment. They pressed forward, their shouts, loud over the storm of gunfire. The momentum had shifted. On the ledge, Thomas couldn't help it. Despite the chaos, despite the danger, pride filled his voice. "Hell of a fight, old friend," he murmured. "Hell of a fight." Wallace saw the collapse coming. Fury twisted his face as he turned toward the SUV. He shoved the man with a briefcase ahead of him, barking orders, trying to carve a path through the chaos. But Rachel was already there. She and two agents slid from cover weapons, raised blocking his path. "Drop it," she commanded, voice sharp as steel. Wallace hesitated only a moment before ripping his pistol free. The FBI opened fire. Bullets struck the ground at his feet, forcing him back. He stumbled, teeth bared, still aiming. Then a surge of agents swarmed him, tackling him to the gravel. His pistol skittered away. Thomas descended. The slope rifle lowered, but recorder still blinking. Red. He strode toward the pinned man voice carrying over the dying gunfire. "Gerald Wallace," he said, tone low and final. "You're under arrest for treason, trafficking, and murder. And this time, no one is coming to bury it for you." Wallace's glare burned, but it was hollow now. His wrists were yanked behind his back, the steel of handcuffs. Clicking shut. The man who had moved like a king now knelt in the gravel, powerless, his empire collapsing around him. The gunfire ebbed, the fog reclaimed the field. FBI agents secured weapons, zipped evidence bags, and dragged Wallace's remaining men to waiting trucks. The metal case was sealed. The burner phone pocketed crates of narcotics stacked in custody. The mine, once a den of ghosts, now bore the silence of victory. Nora leaned against Elena, exhausted, her rifle slack across her lap. She whispered, "Voice hoarse, we made it! Because of them! Because of him!" Her gaze went to Shadow, who stood at the edge of the yard, steam rising from his flanks, chest heaving with each breath. His hide was stray with dust and sweat, but his head was high, ears forward, eyes still fierce. Rachel followed her gaze, her throat tightened, words catching before she could push them free. "He's not just wild," she said softly. "Not just nature. He's justice." Thomas stepped up to Shadow, resting his hand on the stallion's mane. His voice was low, steady, filled with pride. "Good work, old friend. We did it." The horse snorted breath, rolling white into the morning air. The sun, finally, pierced the fog, spilling pale gold across the valley. It glimmered off the handcuffs on Wallace's wrists, off the crates of contraband, now laid bare off the stallion's black hide as he stood. Sentinel. The battle was over, and for the first time in years, hope stirred on, the frozen ground of the Cascades. The courthouse at Mill Creek was not built for spectacle, but on that cold December morning, it held the weight of a nation's gaze. The main chamber was vast, its ceiling arched high, lined with wooden beams, polished smooth by generations. White winter light streamed through tall windows, falling across rows of benches packed with towns, folk rangers, reporters, and federal officers. The air buzzed with anticipation, every cough, every shifting chair echoing. against marble and pine. At the front, beneath the seal of the state of Washington, sat Judge Halderman's silver-haired stern, his gavel resting heavily on the bench. To one side stood the prosecution table, neat stacks of files, USB drives, and hard evidence ready to be unveiled. And at the center in the defendant's box was Gerald Wallace. Gone was the black overcoat and the polished shoes, the aura of untouchable authority. He wore an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled, yet even here, even now, he tried to hold his chin, high eyes sharp, a ghost of arrogance clinging to him. But there was a tremor in his hands when he saw the witnesses gathered: Thomas, Nora, Elena, Rachel, and the colossal shadow of the horse waiting outside the building like some myth made flesh. The charges were read one by one, each like a hammer, striking stone interstate. Narcotics, trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of federal investigation, destruction of evidence, dereliction, and betrayal of public duty. The list went on until the air itself seemed to bow under its weight. Wallace smirked. Fabrications, he muttered. All of it. Then the witnesses came. Elena was the first. She walked with slow steps, still pale. But when she reached the witness stand, her spine straightened. She swore the oath, her hand trembling only once, then spoke. Her voice was soft, still weakened by injury, but each word was clear, ringing through the silence. She described the ambush in the forest and the masked men, the sudden hail of bullets, the cold grip of death as she bled into the snow. And then, her voice tightening, she told of the moment she saw him, Wallace standing in the clearing, giving orders, watching as his own people gunned down the rangers he had sworn to protect. The chamber went still. Reporters stopped writing. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Nora came next. She leaned on her crutch. As she moved toward the stand, her face pale but resolute. She carried a small drive in her pocket, the USB she had hidden even as she lay bleeding in the snow. She handed it over her jaw firm. "This," she said, "is what we were gathering before he betrayed us. The proof of routes of contacts of cartel shipments. Wallace sent us in knowing it was a trap. He tried to bury us with the evidence, but it didn't work." The prosecutor loaded the drive. Maps, recordings, photographs flashed across the screen above the jury. Nora's words drove the knife deeper. He was never protecting the forest. He was protecting himself. Then came the technical evidence. The hidden camera footage from the cabin was played. The room watched in silence as Wallace's grainy figure filled the screen as he bent to hide the burner phone and map beneath the floorboards. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Wallace's smirk faltered. Finally, Thomas's recording. The speakers crackled. Then Wallace's own voice thundered through the chamber. "Don't leave survivors. Kill them all." The words echoed like a death knell. "No," one spoke. Not the jury, not the crowd. Even Wallace's attorney looked away. The man in chains shifted his face, blanching. He stammered, tried to laugh it off. "It's doctored," he spat. "Edited a trick." But then the video froze on his face, captured clear in the hidden camera. The timestamp undeniable. Wallace saw it and the bravado drained. He sagged back into his chair, eyes hollow-mouthed, silent for the first time. The trial moved swiftly after that. Witnesses confirmed. Evidence stacked, like bricks in a wall too high to climb. When the jury returned, their decision was unanimous, without hesitation. Guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel struck. "Gerald Wallace, you are hereby sentenced." The rest blurred into silence. Not because the punishment was unclear, but because the room itself had shifted. No cheers, no applause, just the heavy stillness of justice fulfilled a silence deeper than sound. Wallace bowed his head at last. The man, who had ruled with shadows now drowned in them. Days later, under a pale winter sun, the town of Mill Creek gathered. Again. This time, not for trial, but for honor. The square in front of the ranger headquarters was blanketed in snow flags, snapping gently in the wind. People filled the space. Citizens, rangers, and uniformed FBI agents, even. Children wrapped in scarves, too big for their faces. Cameras lined the edges. But today was not for headlines. Today was for remembrance. A stage had been erected draped in evergreen boughs. At its center stood Sheriff Harland, a voice strong as he addressed the crowd. "We gather not just to close a dark chapter, but to recognize those who risked everything, to bring truth to light." One by one, names were called. Thomas Grayson was first. He hesitated as he stepped forward, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down. He was no stranger to battlefields, but this was different. He wore no uniform. Now, just a worn coat boot scarred from the forest. Yet when the sheriff handed him the plaque, Honorary Citizen of Mill Creek, for courage beyond duty, the air shifted. Applause rang out, not thunderous, but steady, rising like a tide. Thomas's hands shook as he accepted it. He cleared his throat, words rough. I only did what I had to do, what any man would with brothers and sisters in danger. His eyes flicked to Shadow standing at the edge of the crowd. But none of it would have been possible without him. The crowd turned. The stallion stood tall, man black against the snow breath, steaming in the cold. For a moment, silence fell, a reverence beyond applause. Nora was next. Crutch in hand, her steps slow, she mounted the stage. The announcement came clear. Nora Hayes will continue as Chief Ranger of the Cascade District. The cheers that followed were fierce, proud. She lifted her chin, voice firm despite pain. I stand because others stood for me. My duty remains the same, to protect the land and the people who depend on it. Elena followed, younger, her arm still in a sling, but her smile trembled with determination. Elena Cruz is appointed as instructor at the Ranger Academy. Gasps of approval swept through the crowd. Elena spoke briefly, her voice catching. I'll teach them what I learned the hard way. That survival is more than strength. It's trust, it's loyalty, and it's never giving up, no matter the odds. Then Rachel, she stood tall, eyes sharp, her FBI badge glinting. She didn't speak long, but her words carried steel. Wallace was not the end. He was only the beginning. There are places remote, forgotten, where the law doesn't always reach. That's why today I propose the creation of a volunteer force shadow unit. Rangers, veterans, retired agents, people willing to step into the dark when the system cannot. For justice, for those who have no voice. Applause thundered now. People rose to their feet. The idea had roots the moment the words left her lips. Then came the moment. None expected. A local artisan stepped forward. With help, he pulled away a heavy red cloth to reveal what stood beneath. A statue carved from cedar rose against the fading light. It was Shadow, frozen in eternal motion, his mane flowing as though caught in a storm, hooves striking forward with the power to shatter stone. His eyes, painstakingly etched, seemed to gleam with something more than craftsmanship, something alive. The crowd gasped. Tears traced down weathered cheeks. Children reached out with mittened hands, as if they could touch not just the wood, but the spirit itself. The plaque beneath read, "The Forest's Sentinel Shadow." And then, just beyond the statue, the stallion himself stood, massive, silent, proud. For a breathless moment, it felt as if wood and flesh were one. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, and let out a rolling whinny that thundered through the square, rattling rooftops and echoing inside hearts. The people erupted cheers, sobs, applause, because for the first time in memory, a horse was not just an animal. He was honored as warrior, guardian, legend. Thomas Grayson pressed a hand against his companion's neck, his voice trembling with reverence. You earned this, old friend. Shadow leaned into him, warm and steady, as if to remind Thomas that the bond between them needed no words. But as twilight fell and the ceremony waned, something unsettled stirred at the forest's edge. Thomas, walking the ridgeline with Shadow at his side, felt it before he heard it, the crunch of boots where no villager should be. The sun dipped, setting the snow ablaze in fire and blood, when a sharp crack split the silence. A rifle. Too close, too deliberate. Shadow reared, nostrils flaring, muscles taut. Thomas swung, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. Out there, in the shifting shadows, ghosts of the cartel still lingered. Betrayal, it seemed, did not die with winter. From behind, Nora's voice rang, Elena's laughter, Rachel's footsteps hurrying, with a new file in hand, unaware of the danger closing in. Life was moving forward, yes, but the past had not finished with them. Thomas rested his hand once more on Shadow's mane, whispering not of peace this time, but of resolve. They think the fight is over. They're wrong. Man and beast turned together, eyes meeting the horizon where the last light bled away. The cedar statue burned gold in the dying sun, an eternal guardian. And beside it, Shadow snorted, pawing the snow, ready. The wind whispered through the pines, not of silence but of warning. Some scars may heal into monuments, some wounds into redemption, but others remain open, demanding justice. And in that twilight moment, Thomas and Shadow did not stand as survivors. They stood as sentinels prepared for the reckoning still to come.